Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners who want to be able to talk about these issues. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. I'm your host, Anant Raut. This episode is produced and co-hosted by the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee of the Antitrust Law Section as part of our ongoing Mergernomics series. In this series, we deconstruct merger analysis by taking an in-depth look at the economic tests, tools, and analyses that enforcers use to predict whether a merger will harm competition and should therefore be blocked. Each episode will focus on a different economic test. Today's episode is on merger simulations. Joining me today as my co-host is Virginie Caspard, most recently an associate at economic consulting firm Charles River Associates. Welcome, Virginie.
Thanks for having me, Anant.
Virginie is also heading to law school this fall. Good choice.
Yeah, I hope so. We'll find out shortly.
Virginie, who do we have on the show today?
Yeah, today we'll be speaking with FTC economist Ted Rosenbaum. Ted is a deputy director in the Bureau of Economics at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. He has worked on a range of competition matters in his 11 years at the FTC. I should also note that Ted's views today are his own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Trade Commission or any of its commissioners. To get us started, Ted, how would you describe a merger simulation to someone without an economics background?
So a merger simulation is a way of illustrating, using math, how we might expect a market to change following a merger. I know the term merger simulation can sound daunting, but from my perspective, it's really just the story written using math.
As a non-economist, I thought all economic analyses of mergers were merger simulations. You're trying to figure out what would happen if the merger went through. How is merger simulation, the term of art, different from merger simulation, lowercase m, lowercase s?
So we have lots of tools for evaluating mergers, and some focus more on just the merging parties, whereas others focus on the market as a whole. When we talk about merger simulation, the term of art, there what we're trying to do is tell a story about entire markets and how merging parties' competitors will react to the merger. Sometimes when we talk about merger simulation as a broader term, people can mean different things with the spotlight on different actors in the market. But here is the term of art, we're really focusing on the market as a whole.
So Ted, I want to go back to what you said about merger simulations acting as a story. Does this mean that there are characters, plot lines, and other elements we might find in a story?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in general, as economists, I think a key part of our job is to tell stories, to highlight the most important aspects of a whole range of situations. That could be true. We're talking about labor markets, financial markets, or what we're talking about today, what happens before and after a merger. Now, part of the challenge whenever we write a story is balancing detail with parsimony. We want to make sure we get enough detail to capture the key aspects of what's going on, but not so much detail that what's important becomes blurred.
Got it. So that sounds pretty similar to the excess detail we sometimes come across in movies and books, which do make the plot often harder to follow. So returning to this analogy of a merger simulation as a story, can you talk more about the characters and what role they play?
Yeah, so in a merger simulation, we have two main types of characters, consumers and firms. We'll start with consumers. Sometimes when you're purchasing a product that's involved in the merger, then that's you. You're in the story. But more generally, consumers are anyone who's purchasing a product. And that could be firms, individuals, or even the government. The other main characters we'll talk about are the firms selling the products that these consumers buy. Now, as consumers, we decide what to buy from firms, and the firms are deciding how much to charge for their product, typically with the end goal of maximizing their profits.
Got it. So that sounds pretty simple. We're starting with consumers who choose what to buy from various competing firms, which honestly reminds me this morning I walked an extra block to save $1 on coffee. But can you talk about what happens when two of these firms merge?
Sure. After a merger, the firms involved may be able to make more money. And the way they can do that is they can raise the price on the products that they sell. Us economists like to call this upward pricing pressure intuition. If you're interested in learning more about that, you should check out the episode in the series on the Guppy analysis, which is not talking about fish. Here it's an antitrust term of art. This price change is going to affect how other firms behave too. Remember, all firms are trying to maximize profits as they compete with each other. So now the merged parties' rivals are reacting to a different, usually higher price.
Got it. So just to recap for a second, we start out with consumers buying from firms, and the firms are out to maximize profits. So when two firms merge, there's an imbalance in the dynamics previously at play, since they now may have an incentive to raise their price. And thus the other firms in the market may see them raising their price and respond. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly right. As an economist, we model these different players and plot lines into an internally consistent mathematical framework to help give a sense of how this merger is going to play out in real life.
What kind of data are needed for a merger simulation?
So the main types of data that we're typically going to use are information on market shares, or more generally, what products different consumers are purchasing, what the prices for those products are, and some information on costs or price-cost margins. Now, with all of these, whenever we're talking about using these data, we always want to know where they're coming from. So bad data is going to produce bad results. There's an expression sometimes people use, I think in computer science, garbage in, garbage out. That applies here too.
Sounds familiar. So practically speaking, what are some real-life situations in which merger simulations have been used?
So merger simulations are very useful to provide quantitative benchmarks in a range of cases. So one I'll start by highlighting is the Wilhelmsen-Drew case, which was litigated a few years ago. This was a case involving companies making marine water treatment chemicals. And Professor Aviv Nevo, who was the government expert in that case, used a merger simulation to give the court an approximation of the expected harms from the merger. In that case, he testified that the merger would push up prices by between 13% and 50%. Now, that may seem like a very large range, but even the lower end of that range gives us a good indication that this may be a problematic merger. And a real value added of a merger simulation is that we can test the sensitivity of our results to different assumptions. That's likely one reason why Nevo's testimony used such a large range. He was using different sets of assumptions. I should say, I dealt with a similar situation in my own work, where in a different investigation, we weren't sure about the size of the smaller players in the market. Merger simulation let me test a bunch of different assumptions about how big those players were, how many of them there were. Using the merger simulation, I realized that under any plausible set of assumptions I could find, fit with the facts in the market, the merger I was looking at was likely to lead to price increases.
I can't help but notice that you don't mention predicting specific details of what happens after a merger. So in your example with the Wilhelmsen-Drew case, you gave a very wide range of possible price increases. So is it correct that we can't say prices will increase by a certain specific percentage?
So in general, the models we're using, these merger simulations, are going to give us some number that's going to sound extremely precise, 13%. But in my view, merger simulations are not about making these very specific predictions. The goal is to give an approximate sense about what will happen, given all the different features that are moving in a market after a merger. We're not trying to make a super precise prediction. Rather, we want to make sure we're highlighting the key elements and illustrating what, in general terms, will occur.
How exactly does a merger simulation capture the main features of the market?
So merger simulations, beyond giving these specific predictions, which we said are really kind of just illustrative, they can help bring to light aspects of the merger which can warrant particular scrutiny or attention. This is especially relevant in more complex merger cases, like vertical mergers or platform mergers. A few years ago, for example, I used a merger simulation in a platform merger case, where the firms involved were pricing toward customers on one side of the market and aggressively advertising on search engines to customers on the other side. Even though the main customers we were talking to were concerned about pricing, the merger simulation helped us understand the dynamics on both sides of the market. This helped us realize that advertising on search engines was a key driver of the competitive environment here, which helped us focus our investigation on that issue. I also just want to highlight in this context that while we talked earlier about merger simulations being about firms setting prices, this example shows that sometimes we're thinking about firms doing other things in addition to setting prices too, and we can also do that in the merger simulation framework. Here, we're talking about firms setting advertising and deciding on that, which is also something merger simulations can account for. Another example from my own experience where merger simulations can help to highlight critical issues was in a commodities merger. In that case, the merger simulation helped me to see that the key issue was how many customers would switch away from the commodity at issue to other commodities outside of the market of these two merging parties in case where price went up. So for those insiders in economics, we would call this the market elasticity of demand. Once we zeroed in that the market elasticity of demand was really the key issue in this investigation, I could focus and see that under any plausible value of that elasticity, this merger was likely going to substantially increase prices and harm competition.
You've mentioned a lot of cases where merger simulations predict harm. So do merger simulations always result in this kind of conclusion?
Definitely not. One big value of merger simulations, they allow for a consistent framework to analyze benefits from the merger, including efficiencies that might reduce costs for firms and ultimately prices. In the Aetna-Humana merger trial, Professor Raut, also testifying in that case for the government, used a merger simulation to test some claims made by the merging parties. He assumed in his simulation that the parties' post-merger costs would go down. And that illustrated, using the merger simulation, that even once he incorporated that assumption, which would put downward pressure on prices, the merger would still lead to price increases. So obviously, it's not always going to be the conclusion of a merger simulation that prices are going to go up, but the merger simulation allows us to incorporate cost reductions and other things that might put downward pressure on prices into that framework. Now, most frequently, a merger simulation is going to predict price declines from a merger in a situation where the parties don't compete closely and where there are predicted cost savings of some sort from the merger.
Thanks for clarifying that. So as an economist at the FTC, you and your colleagues use merger simulations to evaluate proposed deals, which I've been involved in as well, working as an economic consultant. Could you talk about who else might rely on merger simulations in their work?
So like you said, economists working at government agencies and economic consultancies are going to rely on merger simulations, generally at the pre-litigation phase, as a screening for the merger that can really help to inform economist discussions surrounding nuances of a case as it progresses. These can both be done internal within an agency or even in economist discussions between external consultants and economists within the agencies. Another place we see merger simulations used is in court as part of expert testimony, though I should say the judges don't always value them, like we saw in the T-Mobile and Sprint merger case. However, I think in merger simulations in court can be quite powerful as a tool for corroborating other evidence. They can bring an entire market into one model and a single cohesive story. The judges in Wilhelmsen-Drew and the H&R Block Tax Act decisions specifically talked about the value of merger simulation in corroborating other evidence. So again, this goes back to our idea of merger simulations as a story. They're ways of integrating all the different pieces of a case into one cohesive whole, which I think could be quite valuable in court.
So you mentioned merger simulations as a tool to corroborate other evidence. Are they ever dispositive on their own?
In short, no. A merger simulation can be a very effective tool at pulling together a range of evidence, be it qualitative evidence and quantitative evidence. However, if the merger simulation isn't telling a story that's consistent with the other evidence of the investigation, including qualitative evidence, then it's unlikely it's telling the right story.
How do we know when a merger simulation is in fact telling the right stories? Are there potential red flags you look for when presented with one?
That's an important question, and merger simulations can in fact be very flawed. Underlying assumptions can make or break a model, and so they're quite important to vet. For example, a merger simulation is usually implicitly assuming something about market definition. So you'll want to ask, what does the merger simulation imply about consumer substitution between products? In other words, what's it assuming about who is in and out of the market? Other questions you want to ask, which also relate to market definition, are which geographic areas compete with each other? So really, whenever you're thinking about a merger simulation, you want to ask a lot of the market definition questions you would typically ask when engaging in discussions about product market or geographic market. One thing to be aware of, though, there's typically no one right answer as to the way to incorporate these things into a merger simulation. Although I should say, there are definitely wrong ones. As an example, in a retail merger, it's important to know in those cases what's being assumed about how far people would be willing to travel to go to the retail outlet. The farther the model assumes people are willing to travel, typically the less problematic a merger will be. I would say if you're finding out that people are willing to travel an hour to go to a slightly better grocery store, I'd have some pretty hard questions about whether that's actually plausibly representing individual behavior.
You highlighted some assumptions about consumers, including that they probably won't travel an hour to buy food. But are there any assumptions about firms we should keep an eye out for?
The simulation is typically going to provide a highly stylized description of the way firms compete. So typically, in this situation we've been discussing on this podcast, the models are going to assume that firms are setting their price, and that's going to be very common in retail. That's the situation we've been discussing here as our kind of paradigmatic case. But there are also other types of merger simulations that are engaging with other types of firm behavior, like thinking about firms who are deciding which quantity to set, how much of a product to produce. That's going to be common when we think about commodity mergers. There are other types of competitive environments as well that can be captured in merger simulations, like simulations that think about firms that are bargaining with their customers, or even where they're participating in a bidding market. So frequently, none of these exact paradigms is going to fit the facts perfectly, especially in business-to-business models. You want to discuss with the economists why they made the decisions that they did, and the extent to which that is driving their results.
Another assumption that seems to be baked into merger simulations is that firms are trying to profit maximize. How will the merger simulations work in predicting behaviors by firms in the new economy, i.e. some of these tech companies that seem content to and capable of operating at losses for years while they just focus on growing their business before trying to turn a profit?
It's a great question. And I think our discussion thus far illustrates the power of this approach of telling a story to really be flexible for a range of circumstances. Merger simulations always need to be tailored for whatever industry is at issue. So for example, a merger simulation focused on tech firms might assume that firms are more focused on gaining customers than on maximizing their short-run profits. The tool is flexible enough to incorporate those different assumptions and to evaluate them and include them in our storytelling and in our analysis. Another example might be that in markets focused on innovation competition, there's going to be a tremendous amount of uncertainty about which innovations are going to actually come to fruit. And so a merger simulation accounting for those things is probably going to be important to undertake in that kind of environment. But stepping back broadly, I would just say merger simulations are a powerful tool for a whole wide range of circumstances.
So what about non-price dimensions of competition? For example, whether a merger could result in harms to quality. How useful are merger simulations in that kind of analysis?
Another great question. I would say in those kinds of situations as well, we can think about quality competition as the main ways in which firms are competing and then incorporate that into our analysis and into the telling of our story. It's all about going back to our conversation from the beginning. It's all about isolating those key elements of what are the key features of the market, of how firms are competing, and making sure we highlight those while allowing some of the other stuff to float into the background.
That was probably the clearest explanation I've heard on what a merger simulation is. And Virginie, it's so interesting how it's different from some of the other tests that we've talked about. It's like a puzzle box. You start it, and you're not sure where it's going to lead. Almost like Plinko. What are the key takeaways here for practitioners?
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, Anant. That was very clarifying and illuminating. So thank you, Ted. My first takeaway is that merger simulations tell a story of how markets are likely to change after a merger. Similar to the stories we find in movies and books, they contain elements like plot lines and characters. Secondly, merger simulations serve to highlight features of a market. Contrary to what some may think, they do not predict specific post-merger outcomes. And lastly, data quality and assumptions can strongly impact the outcome of a merger simulation. So it's very important to view these elements with a critical eye.
Thank you, Virginie and Ted, for this incredibly helpful tutorial on merger simulations, capital M, capital S. To our listeners, if you enjoyed this show, be sure to catch other episodes in our Mergernomics series. And as always, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. We'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.